My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 31 years old, and last Thanksgiving, my father grounded me. Not in private, not behind closed doors. He grounded me in front of 30 relatives sitting around the dining room table. 30 adults, watching a grown man get sent to his room like a disobedient child. The moment started with one simple question. Dad, what exactly did Grandma leave me? My father slowly set down his wine glass. The room went quiet. Then he smiled. Not the kind of smile a father gives his son. The kind a judge gives right before delivering a sentence. Well, he said loud enough for everyone to hear, I think it's time someone reminded Daniel where he belongs. A few people chuckled. Then he pointed toward the staircase. You're grounded, he said, until you apologize to your brother. For a second, nobody moved. Then the room exploded with laughter. 30 relatives, laughing. At me. My face felt like it was on fire, but I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I just looked my father straight in the eye and said one word. All right. The next morning, he knocked on my bedroom door, expecting an apology. Instead, he found an empty room. No clothes, no suitcase, no me. And before he could even reach for his phone, the doorbell rang. Standing on the porch was a man my father never expected to see. My grandmother's attorney, holding a leather briefcase filled with documents my father had never read. And the first words out of that lawyer's mouth were, Mr. Carter, what exactly did you think you were doing? Now, before I tell you what was inside that briefcase, let me ask you something. Have you ever been humiliated by your own family? In a room full of people who were supposed to love you? If this story hits a little too close to home, take a second to subscribe to the channel. That way, you can always come back and finish the story later, and you won't miss the next one. Because what happened inside that house the next afternoon changed my family forever. And by the end of it, the man who grounded me in front of 30 people was the one standing there with nothing left to say. To understand how everything fell apart that Thanksgiving, you have to go back 3 months. Back to the morning my grandmother died. Her name was Margaret Carter. She was 86 years old, stubborn as a mule, and sharper than most people half her age. She passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning at St. Luke's Hospital, just outside Dallas. I remember the exact moment I got the call. 6:12 a.m. I was already awake, sitting at the small desk in my apartment, sketching a garden layout for a client in Arlington. Landscape design isn't exactly the career my family hoped I'd choose, but it was the only work that ever made me feel like I was building something real. My phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice sounded thin, like paper that had been folded too many times. Daniel, she said softly, it's Grandma. And I knew. 20 minutes later, I was driving through the gray morning traffic toward the hospital rain, tapping against the windshield. No music. No radio, just the sound of tires on wet pavement and the quiet feeling that something important in my life had just ended. When I arrived, my father was already there. Frank Carter, retired judge, 64 years old, the kind of man who believed a room belonged to him the moment he walked into it. He stood in the hallway outside Grandma's room, talking on his phone, not crying, not grieving, talking about paperwork, probate timelines, estate management, legal filings. Those were the words eared before he noticed me standing there. He ended the call immediately. My older brother Stephen stood beside him in a dark suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Stephen was a corporate attorney now, the pride of the Carter family. They stood shoulder to shoulder like a team, like they always had. I stood a few feet away, holding a cup of coffee from the vending machine that I never even drank. The last time I'd seen Grandma Margaret was 2 weeks before she passed. She had been sitting in the sunroom of her house, wrapped in a blanket, looking out over the backyard garden she used to take care of every morning. The roses had started to wilt because she was too weak to tend them anymore. When I took her hand, she squeezed it with surprising strength. Daniel, she said quietly. Then she leaned closer so no one else could hear. I've taken care of things. I remember frowning, taking care of what Grandma. She just smiled. You'll understand later. At the time, I thought she meant something sentimental. A photograph, a letter, maybe one of her old books. I didn't realize. She meant something that would change my entire life. 3 days later, we held the funeral at a small stone church, about 15 minutes from the house where she'd lived for 40 years. White lilies everywhere, the air heavy with perfume and quiet conversations. My father gave the eulogy, 11 minutes long. He talked about the Carter family legacy, about responsibility, about the importance of carrying the family name forward. He mentioned Stephen 4 different times. He never mentioned me once. After the service, we gathered back at Grandma's house for dinner. The Carter house sat on a quiet street, lined with old oak trees. A large 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch in a backyard that used to look like a botanical garden when Grandma was healthy. That night, 15 relatives sat around the dining room table. My father raised his glass. "Mom left everything for me to manage," he announced. "I'll make sure the family assets go to the right people." His eyes shifted toward me for just a moment. Some things require responsibility. Stephen nodded beside him. No one said anything. I kept eating. Later that night, I went upstairs to the bedroom I had used growing up. The room looked almost exactly the same. Same pale blue walls, same creaky ceiling fan. I sat on the bed and opened the nightstand drawer without really thinking. That's when I saw the envelope, cream-colored paper, my name written across the front in handwriting I would recognize anywhere. Margaret Carter. My hand started shaking before I even opened it. Inside was a 2-page letter, and behind the letter, several photocopied pages from what looked like a legal document. At the top of the first page were 3 words, highlighted in yellow. Irrevocable trust agreement. Halfway down the page was another line, also highlighted. Beneficiary Daniel Carter. My heart started beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then I unfolded the letter and started reading. Daniel, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And your father is probably already doing exactly what I expected him to do. I'm sorry I couldn't stop him while I was alive, but I made sure he couldn't stop you after I'm gone. I sat there for a long time, staring at that page, because suddenly, the quiet conversation in the sunroom 2 weeks earlier made a lot more sense. Grandma hadn't been talking about memories. She had been talking about protection. And at the bottom of the letter, she had written the name of a man I had never heard before. Howard Blake, attorney at law. And beneath that name, a single sentence. Wait for the right moment. He'll know what to do. For the next 2 weeks, I carried my grandmother's letter everywhere, folded carefully inside my backpack, tucked between my sketchbook and a stack of design plans. I read it more times than I can count, and every time I reached the same line, my stomach tightened a little more. Wait for the right moment. The problem was, I had no idea what the right moment looked like. Part of me wanted to call the lawyer immediately. Howard Blake. His name was written clearly under Grandma's signature, along with an office address in downtown Dallas. But another part of me hesitated, because growing up in the Carter family teaches you something very quickly. If my father says something is true, everyone else is expected to believe it. And my father had already made something very clear the night of the funeral. He was in control of the estate, which meant if I walked into a lawyer's office claiming I was the real beneficiary of some secret trust, there was a very real chance I would be laughed out of the room. So instead, I waited. I went back to work. My life returned to its normal routine. Long hours, designing garden layouts for clients who cared more about fountain placement than they did about family inheritance. But every now and then, I would take out those photocopied pages and study them. The document looked real. Official seals, legal language, signatures. But it was incomplete. 6 pages out of what had to be a much larger file. Not enough to prove anything by itself. Then one night, about 3 weeks after the funeral, something happened that changed everything. I was sitting at my kitchen table, answering emails from a client when a new message appeared in my inbox. From Stephen. My brother rarely emailed me directly, which was strange enough on its own. But when I opened the message, I realized something immediately. The email wasn't meant for me. It had been forwarded accidentally, probably from his phone. The subject line made my chest tighten. Trust Amendment Petition. Draft. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. Then I started reading. The email chain was between Stephen and my father. 7 messages, back and forth, each one more uncomfortable than the last. Stephen had drafted a legal petition to file with the probate court. The request was simple: change the beneficiary of Margaret Carter's trust. Remove Daniel Carter. Replace with Stephen Carter. My hands went cold. The justification written in the document was even worse. Financial instability, unreliable career path, outstanding personal debt. In legal language, my brother had built an entire case, arguing that I was too irresponsible to inherit anything. And the worst part wasn't even the formal document. It was the message Stephen had written at the bottom of the email thread to my father. A single sentence. Casual, confident, like the outcome had already been decided. She won't fight it. Daniel never fights anything. That's the beauty of it. I sat there, staring at that line for a long time. Not angry. Not yet. Just quiet. Because in a strange way, Stephen wasn't wrong. For most of my life, I hadn't fought back. Not when my father mocked my career. Not when Stephen joked about my little landscaping hobby. Not when family gatherings slowly turned into performances where I played the role of the disappointing son. I had always chosen the easier path. Stay quiet. Avoid conflict. Move on. But something about reading that sentence changed the air in the room. She won't fight it. The assumption was so absolute, so confident, like I had already surrendered before the game even started. Slowly, I reached for my phone and took screenshots of the entire email chain. Every message, every timestamp, every line. Then I uploaded the files to cloud storage, backed them up on a flash drive, and saved a printed copy inside the same envelope as my grandmother's letter. Only then did I finally do the thing I had been avoiding. I searched the name Howard Blake. The law office appeared immediately. Small practice. Estate planning. Trust law. Downtown Dallas. My finger hovered over the call button for several seconds. Then I pressed it. The receptionist answered on the second ring. Blake Legal Office. My name is Daniel Carter, I said carefully. There was a pause. Then her voice changed slightly. Mr. Blake has been expecting your call. 2 hours later, I was sitting across from the man my grandmother had trusted with everything. Howard Blake looked exactly like the kind of lawyer you would expect someone like Grandma Margaret to hire. Gray hair, thin glasses, calm voice. The kind of man who listened more than he spoke. When I showed him the photocopied pages in the email chain, he didn't look surprised, not even a little. He simply opened a leather folder on his desk and turned it toward me. Inside was the full document. The original trust agreement, stamped, notarized, signed 8 years earlier. And right there, in the center of the page, was the line that made my brother's plan fall apart. Beneficiary, Daniel Carter. Howard Blake leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. There's something else you should know, he said quietly. This trust is irrevocable. I frowned. What does that mean? He gave a small, almost sympathetic smile. It means your father and brother can file petitions all they want. Then he tapped the document gently. But legally speaking, they can't change a single word of it. Thanksgiving arrived about 3 weeks after my meeting with Howard Blake. By then, I knew exactly what my father and Stephen were trying to do. And more importantly, I knew they thought I had no idea. Howard Blake had advised me to stay calm. Don't confront them yet, he said. Let them reveal their intentions first. So that's exactly what I did. When my mother called a few days before Thanksgiving and said my father wanted the entire family together this year, I told her I'd be there. She sounded relieved. My father always preferred large gatherings. More people meant more witnesses, and witnesses meant control. The Carter house was already full when I arrived that afternoon. Cars lined both sides of the street. Aunts, uncles, cousins, people I hadn't seen in years. By the time dinner started, there were at least 30 relatives inside the house. The dining room table only seated 18, so a second table had been set up in the living room. Guess which one I was assigned to? The smaller table, the overflow table, the one usually reserved for teenagers and kids. I didn't complain. Honestly, I expected it. My father stood at the head of the main table, carving the turkey like he was presiding over a courtroom. Stephen sat beside him, wearing a crisp navy suit, even though it was a family dinner. His wife, Melissa, smiled politely at everyone while adjusting the pearl bracelet on her wrist. When everyone had filled their plates and the room finally quieted down, my father raised his wine glass. "I'm glad everyone could make it this year," he began. His voice carried easily across the room. Years on the bench had trained him to speak in a way that demanded attention. "It's been a difficult year losing my mother," he continued, "but the Carter family remains strong." Then he turned slightly toward Stephen. "And I'd like to take a moment to recognize my son Stephen, who recently closed the largest case of his career." People clapped. Stephen lowered his head modestly. The performance was flawless. From the smaller table in the living room, my Aunt Linda called out cheerfully, "Well, what about Daniel? What's he been up to these days?" For half a second, the room went quiet. I opened my mouth to answer, but my father spoke first. "Daniel is still figuring things out," he said lightly. A few people chuckled. "He's very creative, though. Plants flowers for wealthy clients." More laughter. I kept my face neutral. Across the table, my 9-year-old cousin Emma leaned closer and whispered quietly, "Are you okay?" I smiled and nodded. "I'm fine." Dinner continued. Conversations drifted from politics to football to holiday plans. But I could feel something building in the room, like my father was waiting for the right moment to say something important. After dessert, the plates were cleared and people gathered in the living room with coffee and wine. That's when Stephen walked into the kitchen where I was rinsing dishes. He leaned against the counter with that familiar, confident posture he had perfected during law school. "You know," he said, casually swirling the wine in his glass, "you should probably thank Dad." I didn't look up. "For what?" "For letting you stay in the house this weekend," he replied. Then he chuckled. "I mean, after everything you've put him through." The faucet kept running. Water splashed quietly against the dishes. I dried my hands slowly on a towel before turning toward him. "Stephen," I said calmly, "do you know what Grandma left me?" The effect was immediate. The smile disappeared from his face. He stared at me for a moment. Then he set his wine glass down without saying another word and walked out of the kitchen. 10 minutes later, my father's voice thundered through the house. "Daniel." Every conversation stopped. "Get in here, now." I walked into the living room. 30 faces turned toward me. My father stood in the center of the room beside the fireplace. Stephen stood slightly behind him, arms folded. "What did you say to your brother?" my father demanded. His voice had shifted into that deep, commanding tone he used when he wanted absolute authority. "I asked him a question," I replied. My father's jaw tightened. "You threatened him about the will," he said sharply. "You think you can manipulate this family with lies?" I opened my mouth to respond. He didn't let me. "You are grounded," he announced. The words echoed through the room. "You're grounded until you apologize to your brother." For a moment, nobody reacted. Then the laughter started, soft at first, then louder. 30 adults laughing at a 31-year-old man being sent to his room. My father pointed toward the staircase. "Go upstairs," he ordered. "Now." My face felt hot, but I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply looked at him, right into his eyes, and after 3 long seconds, I nodded once. "All right." Then I turned and walked upstairs. I closed the bedroom door behind me, and as the sound of laughter drifted faintly through the floorboards, I pulled out my phone and dialed the only person who already knew the truth. Howard Blake answered on the second ring. "Mr. Blake," I said quietly, "I think tomorrow morning would be a very good time for you to visit my father's house. I left the house at 4:15 the next morning, quietly. No slammed doors, no dramatic goodbye, just a backpack, a folder of documents, and the sound of my footsteps moving carefully down the staircase so the old wooden boards wouldn't creak. The Carter house had always been loud during holidays, but that morning, it felt strangely peaceful, like the house itself didn't know what was about to happen. I stepped outside into the cold November air and walked to my car parked down the street. Then I drove away, not far, just far enough. There was a small diner, open 24 hours, about 3 miles from the house. I ordered a cup of coffee I never drank and sat in a corner booth watching the sky slowly turn gray through the window. At 7:42, my phone buzzed. A message from Stephen. "Where are you? Dad's looking for you." I didn't reply. Inside the Carter house, things were unfolding exactly the way I expected. Later that day, my cousin Mark told me what happened. My father came downstairs around 7:30, freshly showered and dressed like he was about to attend court. Pressed shirt, polished shoes. The man always believed appearances were everything. He poured himself a cup of coffee and looked around the kitchen. "Someone go wake Daniel," he said. Nobody moved. Not out of loyalty, just hesitation. So my father went upstairs himself. He knocked twice on the bedroom door. Sharp, impatient. "Daniel," he called through the door. "Time to come downstairs and apologize." Silence. He opened the door. The room was empty. The bed was made. The closet door hung open. Every drawer was empty. The only thing left in the room was a framed photograph of my grandmother sitting on the nightstand, face down. My father stood there, staring at the empty room for several seconds. Then he slowly walked back downstairs. "Daniel's gone," he announced. Relatives still lingering from the night before looked up from the breakfast table. Stephen shrugged. "Well," he said calmly, "I guess that solves the problem." My father nodded. "Yes," he replied. "I suppose it does." The estate announcement had originally been planned for 10 o'clock that morning. My father had been looking forward to it. He wanted witnesses, a room full of family members watching him explain exactly how the Carter legacy would continue under his control. And with me gone, there would be no objections. Everything was going perfectly. Until the doorbell rang. My mother answered the door. Standing on the front porch was a man wearing a gray suit and holding a brown leather briefcase. Howard Blake. He stepped inside calmly. "I'm here regarding the Margaret Carter estate," he said. The room fell silent almost immediately. My father stood up from the table. His expression hardened. "Mr. Blake," he said slowly, "you were not invited." Howard Blake placed the briefcase on the dining table and unclasped it. "No," he replied evenly, "but I was requested." My father crossed his arms. "By whom?" Howard Blake looked directly at him. "By the beneficiary of Margaret Carter's trust." The words hung in the air. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then my father gave a short laugh. "My son Daniel ran away this morning," he said. "If you're looking for him, you're wasting your time." Howard Blake didn't smile. Instead, he opened the briefcase and removed a thick stack of documents. "I'm not looking for Daniel," he said quietly. "I'm here to address a legal matter." My father's patience was disappearing quickly. "This is a private family gathering," he snapped. "You need to leave." Howard Blake didn't move. Instead, he pulled one paper from the stack and placed it on the table. A petition was filed 3 weeks ago, attempting to alter the beneficiary of Margaret Carter's irrevocable trust. A murmur moved through the room. My father's jaw tightened. "That's none of your concern." Howard Blake adjusted his glasses. "Actually, it is." Then he tapped the document. "Because the petition claims the beneficiary could not be located." His eyes lifted slowly to meet my father's. "And yet, according to several witnesses, that same beneficiary was sleeping in this house last night." The room went completely silent. Stephen stepped forward quickly. "Mr. Blake," he said smoothly, "any legal matters can be discussed privately with counsel." Howard Blake turned toward him. "You drafted the petition, didn't you?" Stephen froze. The calm confidence he had worn all weekend vanished instantly. My father's voice cut through the tension. Enough, he said sharply. Then he pointed toward the door. Get out of my house. Howard Blake calmly closed the briefcase. That's fine, he said. I'll leave. He picked up the case and walked toward the front door. But just before stepping outside, he paused. And Mr. Carter, he said, I'll return at 2 o'clock this afternoon for the formal reading of the estate. He glanced briefly around the room, and this time, I won't be coming alone. Then he walked out. The front door closed behind him, and for the first time in years, my father looked like a man who wasn't entirely sure what was about to happen next. At 1:45 that afternoon, I parked my car 1 street away from the Carter house. The rain from the morning had stopped leaving the pavement dark and shiny under a pale Texas sun. Howard Blake's silver sedan was already parked around the corner, right where we had agreed. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, looking down at the manila folder resting on the passenger seat. Inside were the same documents I had studied for weeks. My grandmother's letter, the photocopied trust pages, the printed email chain between my father and Stephen, and the official confirmation from the bank that the trust account still existed, untouched. Everything we needed. Everything my father thought I would never find. I took a slow breath, grabbed the folder, and stepped out of the car. The Carter house looked exactly the same as it always had. White siding, oak trees lining the street, the wide porch where my grandmother used to sit every morning drinking tea. From the outside, it looked like the perfect American family home, which was exactly the illusion my father had spent 30 years building. I walked up the steps and opened the front door. Inside, the living room had been rearranged. Chairs pulled from every room in the house. 30 relatives, sitting in neat rows, facing the fireplace, like an audience waiting for a performance. And standing in front of them was my father. Frank Carter, pressed shirt, reading glasses perched on his nose, a single sheet of paper in his hand. He was halfway through a speech. As executor of my mother's estate, he was saying I have reviewed her intentions carefully. Then he noticed me. The words stopped. 30 heads turned at the same time. I stepped into the room slowly. Sorry I'm late, I said. My father stared at me. His expression moved through 3 emotions in about 2 seconds. Surprise, annoyance, then anger. Well, he said coldly, look who decided to come back. A few nervous chuckles moved through the room. My father straightened his shoulders. Are you here to apologize to your brother? I shook my head. Number. Then I placed the manila folder on the table beside the fireplace. I'm here to hear the will. The room grew quiet. Behind me, the front door opened again. Howard Blake stepped inside carrying his leather briefcase. He walked calmly across the room and stood beside me. My father's patience finally snapped. I told you this morning to stay out of my house, he snapped. Howard Blake ignored him. Instead, he opened his briefcase and removed the original trust document. Cream-colored paper, red notary seal, State of Texas. He held it up so the room could see. This, he said clearly, is the irrevocable trust agreement executed by Margaret Carter 8 years ago. A ripple of whispers spread through the room. My father's face turned pale. That document is irrelevant, he said quickly. Howard Blake didn't even glance at him. Instead, he began reading. Margaret Carter hereby establishes an irrevocable trust for the sole benefit of her grandson, Daniel Carter. The words landed into the room like a thunderclap. Someone gasped. My Aunt Linda leaned forward in her chair. Howard Blake continued. The trust contains assets totaling $550,000, currently managed by Lone Star National Bank. Stephen's face had gone completely still. Melissa slowly removed her hand from his arm. But Howard Blake wasn't finished. He turned the page. There is also one additional asset included in the trust. He paused. Then he read the line slowly. The residential property located at 214 Willow Creek Road, purchased in 1982 by Margaret Carter, shall transfer in full ownership to the beneficiary upon the settler's death. A stunned silence filled the room. Someone whispered, The house, my father blinked, then blinked again, as if the words had been spoken in another language. Howard Blake lowered the document. For the past 3 months, he continued calmly, Frank Carter has attempted to alter the beneficiary of this trust through a petition filed with the probate court. Then he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a printed email, highlighted in yellow. These messages show coordination between Frank Carter and attorney Stephen Carter to change the beneficiary without notifying the rightful heir. The room turned slowly toward Stephen. He didn't move. My father slammed his hand on the table. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. Howard Blake simply handed the paper to my Aunt Linda. She read the highlighted sentence aloud. "She won't fight it. Daniel never fights anything." The words echoed in the room. 30 relatives listening. 30 witnesses. My father turned toward Stephen. "Do something," he hissed. "You're the lawyer." Stephen stared at the floor. His voice was barely audible. "Dad, it's irrevocable?" My father's hand slipped from the table. The wine glass he was holding fell and shattered on the hardwood floor. Red wine spread slowly across the wood like a stain that couldn't be cleaned. For the first time in my life, Frank Carter looked like a man who had just realized the world didn't belong to him anymore. When people hear a story like this, they often think it's about money, the inheritance, the house, the trust fund. But if you step back and look at it the way a family counselor or legal expert might, the real story is rarely about the assets. It's about power. In many families, power hides behind tradition, behind expectations, behind the quiet belief that some voices matter more than others. For years, Daniel stayed silent, not because he was weak, but because silence is often the role assigned to the person the family decides is less than. And families can repeat that pattern for decades, until someone finally decides to challenge it. What Margaret Carter understood, years before anyone else, was something very important. The truth alone is not always enough. Sometimes truth needs structure, documentation, witnesses, preparation, in other words, protection. That's why she didn't just leave her grandson an inheritance. She left him proof that someone believed in him, proof that fairness was worth planning for. And perhaps the most powerful moment in this entire story wasn't when the documents were read. It was the moment the room went silent, and the truth finally had nowhere left to hide. If this story made you stop and think for a moment about family, fairness, or the courage it takes to stand up for yourself, take a second to press the like button. And if you enjoy stories like this, stories about karma, truth, and the complicated relationships inside families, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because there's another story waiting for you. And the next one might hit even closer to home.